2 hours ago, President Trump appeared in the Oval Office for a live national address announcing that he is declaring a national emergency under the National Emergencies Act, characterizing Canada as posing an imminent threat to American national security that requires immediate activation of emergency presidential powers. The declaration authorizes expanded executive authority including potential military deployment, border controls, economic restrictions, and suspension of normal diplomatic procedures with Canada. Trump stated that 6 months of economic confrontation with Canada has demonstrated that the Canadian government under Mark Carney's leadership pursues policies deliberately designed to harm American citizens and undermine American economic security. He characterized Canadian resource restrictions, worker recalls, and trade countermeasures as coordinated economic warfare requiring emergency response to protect American interests. The declaration immediately activated statutory authorities allowing the president to mobilize National Guard forces without state governor approval, redirect federal resources toward border security, implement emergency trade restrictions, and take actions that would normally require congressional authorization. Within 1 hour of the declaration, the Department of Defense announced deployment of 45,000 National Guard troops to the northern border in what officials described as defensive positioning to protect against potential Canadian economic or infrastructure disruptions. The White House expected the dramatic escalation would shock Canada into immediate capitulation, demonstrate American resolve to domestic audiences, and establish clear message that economic disputes with the United States carry consequences including potential military responses. Within 90 minutes, Mark Carney appeared at a press conference in Ottawa flanked by the flags of all 30 NATO member nations. What he announced was unprecedented in the 75-year history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Canada is formally invoking Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, the collective defense provision that declares an armed attack against one member shall be considered an attack against all members. But before we break down how declaring a national emergency against your closest military ally just caused NATO to activate its collective defense provisions for only the second time in history, and how British, French, and German troops are now deploying to Canada to defend it against the United States, hit that subscribe button and like this video. Carney began by reading the text of Article 5. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. He noted that Article 5 does not require that armed attack has already occurred. It requires only that member states face security threats requiring collective response. The United States has declared a national emergency characterizing Canada as imminent threat to American security. The United States has deployed 45,000 military personnel to the Canadian border in what it describes as defensive positioning. The combination of national emergency declaration and troop mobilization constitutes preparation for potential military action against Canadian territory. Canada has exhausted diplomatic remedies. 6 months of escalating American demands, threats, and economic pressure have demonstrated that normal diplomatic channels cannot resolve the confrontation. The declaration of national emergency and troop deployment represent qualitative escalation from economic dispute to security crisis. Under these circumstances, Canada exercises its treaty right to request Allied assistance in maintaining its security and territorial integrity. Carney announced that NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has called emergency meeting of the North Atlantic Council for tomorrow morning in Brussels. Canada will formally present its case that American actions constitute security threat requiring collective response. However, several NATO allies have already indicated support for Canada's position and willingness to provide immediate assistance. Then Carney introduced military attachés from the United Kingdom, France, and Germany who made brief statements confirming their nation's commitment to Canadian security. The British attaché announced that His Majesty's government is deploying 2,800 troops to Canada for joint training exercises that will position British forces to assist in defending Canadian territory if required. The deployment includes elements of the Royal Regiment of Scotland and the Parachute Regiment, with supporting units arriving at CFB Suffield in Alberta and CFB Petawawa in Ontario. The French representative stated that France is sending 1,900 soldiers to Quebec, where historical and cultural ties create particular French interest in Canadian security. The deployment includes units from the 27th Mountain Infantry Brigade experienced in cold weather operations and the 2nd Foreign Parachute Regiment. French forces will position at CFB Valcartier outside Quebec City. The German attaché confirmed deployment of 2,200 troops to Canadian Arctic territories for cold weather training that will establish German military presence in strategically important regions. Bundeswehr units including Gebirgsjäger mountain infantry and armored reconnaissance elements will train at CFB Yellowknife and CFB Iqaluit, positioning German forces in northern regions where American National Guard deployment is concentrated. The announcements continued. Poland confirmed 1,500 troop deployment in solidarity with Canada and in recognition that nations facing larger neighbors understand the importance of alliance protection. Polish units will position at CFB Wainwright in Alberta. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark announced smaller deployments totaling 1,200 additional troops to various Canadian bases. Within hours of Carney's press conference, over 12,000 NATO troops from 6 allied nations were either already deploying or had confirmed deployment orders to Canada. The geopolitical implications were staggering. For the first time in NATO history, alliance collective defense provisions were being invoked not against external adversaries like the Soviet Union or international terrorism, but against actions by a NATO member state. American troops mobilized to the Canadian border now faced the prospect of confronting British, French, and German forces deployed to defend Canada from American actions. The Pentagon response was immediate alarm. Joint Chiefs of Staff requested emergency meeting with the President. Senior military officials made clear that American forces cannot and will not engage NATO allied troops. The entire premise of NATO is mutual defense among democratic allies. American military doctrine, training, and strategic planning assumes cooperation with British, French, and German forces, not confrontation. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, issued unprecedented public statement: American forces are trained to fight alongside British, French, and German troops against common adversaries. We share intelligence, coordinate operations, and train together constantly. The scenario of American troops facing Allied forces represents not just political crisis but operational impossibility. Our forces are not prepared, equipped, or authorized to engage NATO allies. The scenario of American troops facing Allied forces across the Canadian border represents operational and strategic impossibility. Field commanders receiving deployment orders to the northern border immediately sought clarification on rules of engagement if they encounter British or French forces. No such rules exist because the situation has never been contemplated in NATO history. Secretary of Defense issued statement emphasizing that National Guard deployment to northern border is purely defensive, that no offensive operations are planned or contemplated, and that American forces will maintain full coordination with NATO allies to prevent any incidents or miscalculations. The statement was clearly intended to reassure European allies and prevent the National Emergency Declaration from triggering actual military confrontation. Congressional reaction was swift and bipartisan. House Speaker called emergency session to consider resolution challenging the National Emergency Declaration under the National Emergencies Act, which allows Congress to terminate emergency declarations through joint resolution. Senate Majority Leader stated that declaring national emergency against NATO ally exceeds any reasonable interpretation of emergency authority and creates alliance crisis that threatens American security more than any action Canada has taken. Senator Mitt Romney stated, "The President has created a situation where American troops face British and French forces across a border with our closest ally. This is insanity. Congress must terminate this emergency declaration immediately before we find ourselves at war with NATO." Senator Lindsey Graham added, "I have supported strong responses to Canadian economic actions, but declaring national emergency and deploying troops has gone too far. We cannot have American soldiers staring down the British Army across the Canadian border. This ends now. International reaction focused on the unprecedented nature of NATO collective defense invocation against member state actions. The European Union issued a statement expressing full support for Canada and noting that American actions threaten the foundation of transatlantic alliance. The United Kingdom emphasized the special relationship with both the United States and Canada but made clear that NATO treaty obligations require supporting Canada when it faces security threats from any source. NATO Secretary-General Stoltenberg issued a carefully worded statement noting that the situation is unprecedented and that tomorrow's North Atlantic Council meeting will address how alliance responds when member state actions create security concerns for another member. He emphasized that NATO's fundamental purpose is collective defense and that all members have obligations to refrain from actions threatening other members' security. Russia and China responded, highlighting NATO division. Russian Foreign Ministry noted if NATO members invoke Article 5 against each other, alliance has lost coherent purpose. Chinese officials suggested American unilateralism alienating traditional allies, creating opportunities for nations seeking alternatives to American-led order. Here is what makes this moment historically significant for understanding alliances and collective security. NATO was created as a defensive alliance among democracies sharing values and facing common external threats. The alliance assumes that members will not threaten each other and that collective defense provisions address external adversaries. When a member state declares national emergency against another member and deploys military forces to their shared border, the foundational assumptions collapse. Article 5 was designed to deter Soviet aggression and has been invoked only once in NATO history, after the September 11 attacks when allies came to American defense. Using Article 5 to defend against actions by a NATO member represents conceptual inversion that threatens alliance coherence. If members cannot trust each other to refrain from military threats, collective defense becomes meaningless. The deployment of European troops to Canada creates operational situation without precedent. American and Allied forces train together, share intelligence, coordinate strategies, and plan joint operations against potential adversaries. They are not prepared or organized to confront each other. 2 hours ago, Trump declared national emergency against Canada and deployed 45,000 troops to the border, characterizing Canada as imminent threat to American security. 90 minutes later, Carney invoked NATO Article 5, and within hours British, French, German, Polish, Dutch, Belgian, and Danish troops totaling over 12,000 personnel were deploying to Canada to defend it against potential American military action. NATO is holding emergency session to address collective defense invocation against member state for first time in alliance history. And right now, American National Guard troops are taking positions along the northern border while European allied forces are arriving in Canada. Pentagon officials are explaining to the president that American military cannot engage NATO allies. Congress is preparing emergency vote to terminate the national emergency declaration, and NATO headquarters is trying to prevent the first armed confrontation between alliance members in the organization's 75-year history.